Good afternoon and welcome to the machine learning course. I'm going to split these 2-hour slots into 2 lectures so we can have a short break between. And I'm going to start this first one with some formalities on how the course will work and the goals of the course and so on. And also try to give you a brief introduction and overview of what machine learning is and what will be our concerns during the course. So first, I'm Ludwig. I'll be in charge of the lectures and these 2 tutorial classes, P1 and P6. At the moment, P1 is reserved to the Big Data Masters program because it's supposed to working hours and so on. But eventually, we'll probably open it to everyone because there will be some vacancies left. So if you are having problems finding your tutorial class, just wait about till the end of the week or something like that, and we are going to start solving these problems. Okay? Professor Francisco Azevedo is in charge of the other tutorial classes. You have all the information on the course on this site, where I shall put the planning of the classes, the slides, the lecture notes, and also the videos, assuming all these devices work correctly. I will put also the videos of the lectures online. In any case, what you have there at the moment is the planning based on last year's classes. There can be some changes, so keep up to date by consulting the page. And when you download the slides and the lecture notes and so on, remember that anything that is in the future is subject to changes, so I will keep updating the slides as I give the lecture. So these classes will be 2 hours per week of lectures, where I'm going to split into 2 blocks of 1 hour, and I'm going to try to make them only partially exposition. So I will try to aim at about 70% of the time me talking, so we have some time for questions. This will vary a bit depending on the subject matter in each day, but the idea is that you can ask questions and clarify anything that you didn't understand every week in these lectures, so that you can accompany the subject matter better. The tutorials, you have blocks of 2 hours, 1 block of 2 hours per week, and this is mostly for you to clarify things about the practical assignment. So ideally, you could try to do the tutorial parts at home because you have a tutorial guide. In theory, you should be able to do it by yourself, but of course there are always questions and so on, and you can use the tutorial classes to clarify anything. So if you do the exercises and everything is easy, you don't need to come to the tutorial classes. If you have questions, you can come to the tutorial classes. If you just come to the tutorial classes to do the exercises, this will probably not be ideal because you can waste time coming to the classes and do something that is easier, or you don't have time to ask all the questions because you're just looking at the things for the first time. So I would advise you to at least look at the guide for the tutorials and try to do the exercises or start the exercises for yourself so you have questions when you come to the tutorial classes. There will be some lectures reserved for revision, so specifically in the weeks where we have tests, we are advised not to advance on the subject matter. So those lectures will be reserved for questions and revising the matter and so on. This year we don't have any holidays on our days, on our class days, so we have 1 extra day that is usually the case. And this allows me to dedicate also one of the lectures probably to help you with the assignment, with the final assignment. Now for the assessment, there are 2 components. The theoretical part, which you can pass either with the 2 tests or the exam. Note that the exam is scored in 2 independent parts. So everybody is writing the same exam, but when I'm grading the exam, there is 1 part that corresponds to the first test and 1 to the second. This means that even if one of the tests didn't go well for you, it still pays to come to the other one because then you have that part of the grade guaranteed in the exam. Okay? So remember, the exam will be scored in 2 independent parts. You are allowed to bring your notes for the exam. They should be handwritten by you alone, so you don't photocopy the notes, but each one of you can bring their own notes to the exam. The assignments will be in groups of 2 students from the same tutorial class, and you'll be graded on the assignment that you submit, but then there is also an individual component of the assignment. This is also written during the test. It's separate from the test because it's not part of the theoretical evaluation, but it's a kind of a discussion of the assignment to help distinguish between students who really did the assignment or just had a colleague who did the assignment. And so there will be specific questions about the assignment in the day of the test. This also means that if you don't want to take the tests and leave the theoretical part for the exam, you still should come in the day of the test just to do the defense of your grade for the assignment, okay? Groups will be formed by October 7th. I will post the detailed instructions for that, but the idea is forming groups and submitting the assignments is all done through this email address using your official FCT email address. So you will send from your FCT account to this email address, and it will be processed automatically because in theory only you have the password for your account, so we know who is sending the email message. To form groups, you just send an email message with the number of your group partner, and if both of you send the number of the other one, the group is confirmed. For submitting the assignments, you just send a zip file with the files that we're going to specify with your assignment. One important thing is that both members of the group must send exactly the same zip file, and they both must send the file. If one member of the group does not send a file, then this means he or she did not do the assignment, so will not be graded. But I will post these instructions in detail when the time comes. Just remember that this email address is only for automatic processing, so you should only send messages from your official FCT account, and you should not send questions or anything to that email address because we're not going to read them. We're going to be receiving 190 emails at a time, so we're not reading everything. Yeah? Sorry? You can, in theory, do the project alone, yes, but this should be reserved only for specific problems such as you have an odd number of students in one of the tutorial classes or things like that. So, for example, if you have 33 people in one class, one of them will have to do the assignment alone. But you should avoid that because this is basically a logistic matter. There are 191 of you at the moment, and there are only 2 of us. So unless you only want the grades by July or something like that, you have to do the assignments in groups of 2. It's also a problem in the laboratories because we can only guarantee one computer for 2 students. Of course, you can bring your own, but that's something we cannot guarantee on our side. Okay? So for the evaluation, you are required to have at least a passing grade in each component to get approval in this course, and the final grade is simply the average of both components. If you have the practical part done from previous years, after 2015 when we changed to Python, then it's still valid, so you don't need to enroll in the tutorial classes. Or you should not enroll in the tutorial classes, because otherwise you are abdicating your grade, previous grade. We're going to use Python 3, and I recommend this Spyder, the development environment, but you can choose your own. In any case, when you submit your assignments, you have to submit the code as Python models, as Python source code files. So if you use something like Jupyter or something like that, remember that then you have to save things in order to submit them. But you are free to work with whatever environment you prefer as long as you submit the assignments in the correct format. We're going to use several libraries for numerical computations, machine learning and so forth. So if you are installing a new installation of Python, I recommend using this distribution, Anaconda, because it has everything that we're going to use. You just install that distribution and you're ready to work. I supply lecture notes, so summaries about the lectures and the slides. This will be at least what you should read. I also recommend reading this book, Pattern Recognition by Bishop. These are the main sources for you to study. Furthermore, I recommend reading some additional authors. Mitchell here is mostly for historical interest, but mostly Alpiden and Marsland. And the idea here is that if you want to just memorize things for the exam, this is not very efficient to read things from different sources. But to help you really understand things and get an insight on the subject matter, it helps to read things explained in different ways, with different notations and so on, because it helps you generalize the important parts instead of focusing too much on the details. So that's why I usually recommend chapters from different books at the end of each lecture. This is mostly to help you get an idea of the fundamental notions instead of just memorizing details. Also note, you can look at tests and exams from previous years. My exams and tests are usually focused on figuring out how well you can explain something. So it's not so much a matter of memorizing algorithms or things like that, but being able to explain the basic notions. Okay? So let's start with the subject matter. Now, what is this thing, machine learning? This is, it seems to be a very new thing. It's fashionable now, but it's actually, the basic idea is fairly old. So in 1959, we have this proposal that we could have this field of study to give computers the ability to learn by themselves. So to learn something without being explicitly told about that thing. And this is the goal of machine learning. More recently, Mitchell gave us a more formal and operational definition, something we can actually use in practice, which is that if you have some specific task that you want done, and you have a measure of performance for that task, so you can measure how well that task is being done, then you can say that the computer program is learning from experience to do that task if its performance, according to that measure for that task, is increasing as you give it experience. So as you give it information about what needs to be done, or what should the task, how the task should be done. Note that this experience does not require you to actually program each step, but you should be able to give examples to the computer, and the computer improves the performance. And this is the idea of machine learning that we're going to follow here. So basically, what do we need when we specify a machine learning problem? We need to have a clear idea of what is the task that we want to perform. We need to be able to measure performance in that task. And then we need data that can help us improve this performance in that task. So these are the three basic elements for a machine learning problem. I'm going to illustrate with this example. We have a reference here for the paper, but the idea here is to identify or understand requests and process them accordingly. Requests for flight information and ticketing in the airports. So people want to reserve tickets or want to ask about flight times and things like that, and the system needs to be able to process those requests appropriately. And what we need is to train a system that will perform at identifying the fragments of the text correctly. For example, please book me on means that the person wants to book a flight. Flight 21 is the identification of the flight. I would like to fly, this means the destination, the place the person wants to go to. So we want to have a system that can add these notations to the text so that then the text can be processed adequately. This would be the task. The performance, we need some measure by how many mistakes the system is making and so on. And the data would be a previously annotated corpus of these tests, so examples of what the system must do correctly, that then the system can use to learn and to increase performance. Now, we can always, within this idea that we have a task, a performance measure, and data, we can think about different types of problems that we want to solve. For example, if we want to predict a continuous value, say the price of some object or things like that, then we have what is called a regression problem. We are trying to find a way of predicting something that varies continuously. If we are trying to predict something that is discrete, for example, a set of classes like this email is spam, this email is not spam, then we have a classification problem. Now this may seem at this point a bit arbitrary, this distinction, but we will see that it makes a big difference if we are trying to approximate some unknown function, which is what we do in the case of regression, or if we're trying to split our data sets into different regions where the different classes are, which is what happens in classification. So splitting the data into different partitions is different from trying to adjust some function as close as possible to the data. Then we have other things like figuring out association rules. So if someone is buying diapers, they will probably also buy baby formula or things like that, or trying to figure out events that go together. Or we want to try to join together similar examples. This is what we're going to see in clustering. We want to estimate some, say, probability distributions or densities. For example, you have in a map a series of locations where the Asian wasp was identified, where nests were found, but you need to have an idea where things are more concentrated or less, so you can generalize from those points some kind of continuous function that will give you that. So all of these are examples of machine learning problems, and they have different characteristics. For example, in some cases you know what the target is. For example, if you want to predict prices, you need to have a data set with the correct prices from which you can learn. In other cases, you don't have an actual target that you're going to try to find. So for example, if you want to group together similar clients from some company, you don't have something to aim for, you don't know what the group will be, you just want to put those that are similar together and those that are different in different groups. But we're going to look more carefully at these differences later on. Another aspect of machine learning is that this is not just a computational problem or not just informatics or computer science, but it touches other fields, other parts of science. So you have lots of statistics and probability, the adjustment of these models, and we're going to go through a lot of formulas related to probability and statistics because of that. Mathematics is also very important, not only for the understanding how the algorithms work, but also on the implementation part, because you need good optimization algorithms. We are not going to focus that, so we are going to use the optimization algorithms as black box. They are implemented, we just use them, but still bear in mind that there is a lot of sophisticated mathematics behind these solvers so that we can find the solution. And then we have also, for example, inspiration on how humans learn and animals learn and the nervous system works. One proeminent example of that is deep neural networks, which are strongly inspired in biological systems, and also lots of philosophical and ethical problems related to this idea of learning, what learning is, and what the consequences are of machine learning systems. So remember that this is not just informatics, this is quite a broad area with implications on lots of parts on science and philosophy. But what do we want, why do we want machine learning? Why should we use this kind of system? The most important or most useful application of machine learning is for when we don't explicitly know how to solve a problem. So we cannot write the rules for solving a problem. If we cannot write the rules, then we cannot write a program to solve the problem, and we'll need to solve it in some way by which the computer learns by itself. So for example, suppose that you want to identify the digits that are handwritten. We know that this is a 9, a 6, a 2, a 0, a 3, but how do we know that these are the digits? So imagine that you wanted to write the rules from which you get a bitmap, a matrix of pixels with white and black pixels, and then you write the rules to map from each possible bitmap into one digit. We don't really know that if this pixel is black, is this a 9, but maybe it's the same pixel for the 6, and maybe if the 9 is written a bit down, then it's still a 9, but it's not that pixel. So it would be very hard to write the rules explicitly to try to convert these into, or interpret these handwritten digits into the digits. But we can train, if we have a system that can learn by example, that can improve performance with this experience at this task, then we could ourselves label a set of these handwritten digits and then give those examples to the system and let the system try to generalize from the examples and then interpret correctly new handwritten examples that we did not look at ourselves but just feed into the program. So this is something that works. We have, it's actually one of the classical examples for machine learning. You're going to see some, have some contact with this, the MNIST dataset, for example. And it's one of the earlier examples of success for machine learning. Other problems include when you have very large amounts of data. If you want to write some rules to process the data, you usually have to look at the data and try to figure out the patterns there. If the data is really huge, there's a huge amount, it's hard for humans to try to find patterns there. So, and also, if you have lots of data, then it's easier for computers to learn from the data. The more data you have, the easier it is, apart from computational issues, but the easier it is for systems to learn correctly. So if you want to use, extract some knowledge or organize or try to understand something about patterns in Google searches, in Facebook relations, in credit card use or something like that, which produces huge amounts of information, then machine learning is very useful. Another field where machine learning is useful is where conditions change. And so if you had to write things down as a program with explicit rules, you would have to keep revising your program as conditions change. If the system can learn by itself, then you just keep adding new information and it will adjust to the patterns in the new data it is receiving. One example of this is personalization of your Facebook feed. So depending on what links you click, on what you like and so on, something behind that is constantly looking at what you're doing and learning what makes you spend more time on Facebook, so that can increase revenue from advertising and so on. So those systems have to adapt not only for each individual user, so it would be impossible for people to do that by hand, but also keep changing depending on how the tastes or the inclinations of the user change. So basically, machine learning is good when you don't have an explicit recipe and you have data. The more data, the better. So now let's move on to some basic concepts to start understanding how we can solve this problem. So one of the most fundamental ones and most abstract is the hypothesis class. So we're not going to use this one in practice a lot, but I would like you to start by this one because it's really the most broad and most abstract of the concepts we are dealing with here. So this is the set of all possible hypotheses that we are admitting when we're trying to solve a machine learning problem. And basically, what are these hypotheses? These would be the answers that we obtain after the system learns. For example, suppose that we have this data set. We have a cloud of red points, a cloud of blue points, and we want to learn from these examples some general way of separating red from blue. So imagine that in the future we're going to be looking at examples to which we know the coordinates, so we'll have 1 point here, 1 point here, and so on, and we have to predict whether they are red or blue. So the first thing we need to do is to figure out what kind of hypothesis are we going to admit. So what will be the general shape, let's say, of this rule for distinguishing red and blue examples. One possibility would be horizontal lines. Let's say we are looking at this and we suspect that points are red when they occur here near the top, or they are blue when they occur near the bottom. So we have this hypothesis class. The hypothesis class is the set of horizontal lines that we can draw here. Now we can represent this hypothesis class with a model. The model is an expression, a way that we can describe what the hypothesis class here. So this could be a model for our hypothesis class. Our hypothesis class is blue is below some line, red is above the line, and we consider all the possible horizontal lines here. We can describe in this way. Blue class is for epsilon y less or equal to some theta 1. This is a parameter that we can change to cover all the hypothesis classes. So as we change theta 1 there, we can change the position of the line. So what's the difference between the hypothesis class and the model? Basically, the hypothesis class is the set of hypotheses that we accept. The model is a description, usually a parametric one, where by changing the parameters we can cover all this class of hypotheses. So the hypothesis class is more abstract, the model is the actual thing we're going to work with. And the hypothesis is what we get when we instantiate the parameters of the model. So if we put some value there, for example 0, we have the hypothesis that separates red from blue. Of course, we could consider other hypothesis classes. For example, circles of radius 1. Let's say that instead of suspecting that red is above and blue below, we suspect that blue falls within a circle of radius 1, and we just want to figure out where we're going to place the circle. So now we have a model with two parameters that represents this hypothesis class, which is all those circles of radius 1 where the blue class is. Now, why do we need this? You can see that when we choose a hypothesis class, we are committing to something. So we have this abstract set of all hypotheses. We describe that with a model, usually with some parameters, and then we are going to pick one hypothesis from that hypothesis class by adjusting the parameters. For example, we say that theta 1 is 0 in the first model here. We are representing this hypothesis here. Or if we say that theta 1 and theta 2 are minus 1, then we are choosing this specific circle. This is an hypothesis. In machine learning, once we select the hypothesis class and model everything and so on, then we want to find the best hypothesis. It's easy to see that putting the circle here looks good, but if we were to put the circle for the blue class here, then it wouldn't be a very good hypothesis because it doesn't match the data adequately. But there is one problem here. When we decide that we want to separate this with a horizontal line, for example, we are biasing everything because now we are only considering horizontal lines. If we decide to do it with circles, then we are biased towards circles and we are only considering circles. This is called inductive bias. We are biasing our learning process to a given predefined hypothesis class. Why do we do this? Because there is no alternative to learning. The only way that we can learn is if we have an inductive bias. And this is easy to understand if you try to think about what it is we're doing when we're trying to learn. We're trying to figure out what is some general pattern that the data is following. These data that we have are only a sub-sample, just a sample from all the possible data from all the universe. We are trying to extrapolate from this data to everything that is outside and will come later, and it's in that whole universe. The only way that we can extrapolate is if we bias our learning towards some specific hypothesis class. If we are doing like this, we are trying to figure out, okay, blue will fall into a circle, red will be outside that circle, and now we're going to try to find out the best circle. And when we do that, we can generalize. We can predict, for example, that a point that falls here should be red because it's outside the circle. It may be wrong, the hypothesis class, but at least we can use it to generalize. Now imagine that we don't do that. We don't have any hypothesis class. Then the only thing we know is that this point here is red, this point here is blue, but what would a point there be? We have no idea. Or even there in the middle, because if we're not assuming anything about the data, then we cannot really go beyond what we already know. And this would be, for example, an analogy is with gravity. We all assume that there will still be gravity tomorrow. We are not going to nail our furniture to the floor or so on because we are afraid it will start flying. But why do we assume that? We don't really have data for tomorrow yet, but we have this inductive bias that since gravity has been on for 13 1,000 million years, then it should be on tomorrow too. But this is an example of inductive bias. So we're going to look at this in a bit more formally by the middle of the semester, but for now I'd like to just give you this idea that because we want to extrapolate from known data to outside the data, and we want to generalize, we want to have some idea of what the general pattern is, we need to bias our reasoning by selecting some hypothesis class. So we are narrowing things down in order to be able to generalize. If we don't do that, we cannot generalize. So let's see some basic kinds of machine learning problems. The first one that we're going to focus on, the first one is actually supervised learning. This would be the second one by the end of the semester, but is the one that has the simplest diagram here. In unsupervised learning, what we have is basically a system that learns to represent our data. So the features will be the input to the system. Each feature will describe one aspect of each example. So you can think of examples as rows on a table. Each column is a feature, each row of the table is an example. In the case of structured data, of course, this can be more confusing if you have things like sound files or images or video where you don't actually have those things organized. But the basic idea is that the features describe the examples, and in unsupervised learning, we want to learn some additional features that help us describe better the examples. So let's see, one example of this would be clustering images. The inputs for this algorithm would be a set of images and also the HTML tags. So this is for the web. In this particular paper, they are looking at the images, features extracted from the images, and also from the tags associated to the image. And then the algorithm will group them together. For example, here you see images that have, in the second row, this is one of the groups. They have more or less the same colors, and you see here a planet, and then Pluto. And so basically this is the group for Pluto, which includes the dog and the planet, because it's also looking at the tags, and images that are visually alike. Okay? So here you also see Pluto, but with different colors, and it's grouping them in different rows because of the colors, but also grouping them together because of the tags. So in this case, we don't have actually a target. We don't know at first which group things should fall into, but we have the idea that we should label each image into some group in a way that makes it close to images that are similar and separates into different groups from images that are different. So we get this new information about how to group the examples. So basically the idea here is that we have only the features, we don't have target labels, but we want to find structure in the data. And this allows us to obtain new information that we can use to describe our data. For example, which group the data belongs to, and so on. Supervised learning is what we're going to focus in the first half of the semester. And the idea here is that the data we extract, we use features that are input to the learner, but we also have in our data the target values. We know what the system should be outputting for those particular examples. And so we can compare what the learner is outputting with the target values and measure the error in the prediction. So in this case, it's supervised learning because during the learning process, we can continuously inform the system of what errors it's making or how much it is wrongfully predicting what we want, and then use this information to reduce the error as much as possible and try to improve our predictions. So in this case, we have two classes of this type of machine learning problem, which is regression, when we're trying to predict a continuous value. In that case, we want to approximate as much as possible from the predictions. Or in classification, which basically means that we want to split apart our data set into different categories. They may not be close together or something like that in some spatial representation, but we want to know where to separate them in order to distinguish the different classes. One example of supervised learning is face identification. So in this case, the learning system learned to identify faces by having regions labeled in photographs where the faces existed and to identify those faces. And then this is an example of how it was tested afterwards. We give it new photographs and ask the system to identify the faces. So here, I don't know if you can see very well from there, but in some images it seems to work fine. Here there is a pattern in the tiling on the wall that looks like a face, and the system identified as a face. In this case, there is a woman here who has the face at an angle, so the system did not identify because it was only trained with faces that were vertical with the eyes aligned and so on. So you can see some features and some limitations of this system, because what you get basically depends a lot on the data that you put into the system too. Another different type of machine learning problem, and we're not going to focus on this type of problems in this course, but it's also an important machine learning problem, is reinforcement learning. This is somewhat similar to supervised learning in that you can tell that something went wrong, so there was a mistake, but you cannot tell exactly when the mistake was made. So suppose you're teaching a system to play a game of chess, for example. There could be a move that was really bad, and then 10 moves later you lose the game. But now you don't know which was the move that was really bad. So you need to figure out to assign credit to each decision, but you only know the outcome later. Or if you're teaching the system to drive a car, if it turns when it shouldn't, then maybe a few seconds later it crashes into the tree, but then you need to figure out what was the decision that went wrong before it crashed. So these are examples of reinforcement learning, where basically you are feeding the learner with the features, the learner gives you some output, some decision, so on, and then there is something, either we or the environment or something like that, that can give some feedback, but it's not necessarily associated with each specific decision. It's just that the system will have to learn to assign credit to whatever mistakes it did. And then we have ways of mixing things together. For example, it's very common to use semi-supervised learning, where you have a data set where you have all the target values. So imagine this kind of problem here. You need a data set where in all the images the faces are properly identified so that the system can learn. You need to have previously identified faces. But this tends to be costly. You need to actually label everything first, and you need a large data set, so someone has to do that work. One way of doing this is that you have some data labeled, but then use unsupervised learning methods, for example like clustering, feature extraction and so on, to enrich your data set with data that is not yet labeled, by, for example, grouping together things that are similar or some similar approach. And then you use that enriched data set to help with the supervised learning. So basically we can mix these approaches and improve the results. So don't think of these as isolated or separated things, but kind of ideas that help us understand the problems, but we can go beyond them. In any case, for this course, we're going to focus on supervised learning in the first half, and then unsupervised learning in the second half of the semester, because this is the first course you have on machine learning, and we are focusing mostly on the basic concepts. From this, hopefully you can then go into more complex and sophisticated things, but you need to understand the basics. So these would be the goals for the course. First of all, a clear understanding of the foundations of machine learning, what are the actual problems we are solving, the techniques for solving them, and so forth. And also some practical experience with machine learning techniques and how to apply them. So you're going to be using scikit-learn, which is a library for machine learning, and lots of the algorithms we're going to talk here are implemented there, and you can have some practical experience using them. Another important goal is to learn to understand the literature and the language that is used to describe machine learning problems. So this is where a lot of mathematical formulas will come in. Don't be afraid of them, because I will not ask you to demonstrate the theorems or things like that, but it's important for you to get some familiarity with that notation, because all the books and papers and so forth that you can read in machine learning if you want to proceed in this area will be written in that language, and you need to be familiar with that. Okay, so we're going to insist a bit on that mathematical part. So the plan for the semester, we're going to start with this introduction and supervised learning. We're going to focus first on regression problems, then on classification, and look at different classifiers and ways of combining classifiers. And this is approximately half of the semester. Then we have the first test for these parts, and then we start with the learning theory, which is a more formal grounding foundation for what we discussed previously, and go to unsupervised learning, especially clustering, but also feature selection, feature extraction, visualization, things like that. So the second test will be about that part, and for the exam, these two parts will be separated. So you can, if you have a good grade in one test, you can skip that part on the exam if you want, or something like that. So to sum up this first block, the idea of machine learning is try to learn from experience, from the data, without having to put in explicitly the rules for how we want to perform some task. We saw this general abstract notion of the hypothesis class, which is the class of hypotheses that we're going to admit, and how this biases our reasoning. We are focusing only on that class of hypotheses, so are excluding everything else. This seems to be a bad idea, but it's the only way that we can then generalize and extrapolate from the data that we have to new information. And then we saw different types of machine learning problems, and we're going to focus on these two, supervised learning and unsupervised learning mostly. So this, I'll always give you some recommendations that then you can read. So from the books, you can look at chapter 1, or sections 1 to 4 on these three, for this part, introductory part.